Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honour to be chosen to speak at the Doctoral Inaugural Lectures, so thank you very much for coming, and I hope you'll find my research interesting. So to begin with, I'll just give a bit of a background about myself. Prior to starting my PhD, I spent several years working in the museum and historic house sector. And during this time, it became obvious to me that we knew very little about the significance of the wallpapers that we have in our museum and archive collections, and of course any new discoveries that we find in historic houses during renovation works, etc. So what we were lacking, and what I wanted to know, was what class of person bought these wallpapers, when and why, and was there a social, cultural or status significance to the type of wallpaper that was being manufactured and chosen during this period of the long 18th century. Previous research on the subject had concentrated on studying the art historical element of wallpaper, with the emphasis on the use of wallpaper by the upper classes, the elite and gentry and so forth. Much of this has stemmed from the fact that our national collections of wallpaper from this period are looked after in museums of art and design, or in stately homes, where collecting policies in the past have concentrated on preserving examples of the best designs and the best quality manufacture. In this respect, wallpaper history is similar to the material and cultural histories of other domestic goods from this period, which have also tended to concentrate on studying the consumption patterns of the elite and upper classes. As this group left proportionately more written records of their daily lives in their diaries and letters and so forth, and because they were buying better quality items, which are often more likely to physically survive over time. So, aside from helping us to better understand the material culture of the historic wallpapers that survive today in our collections, what else can a study of this subject add? Well, the subject can also contribute to wider historical debates on economic, social and consumer history of the long 18th century. Wallpaper is a really good illustrative example of one of the many new consumer goods that became increasingly available in the period. The consumer revolution, as it's termed, ran in tandem with the industrial revolution at this time and saw the growth in the development, manufacture and affordability of a wide range of new consumer goods for the home, from chinaware and cutlery to ornaments, furniture and printed fabrics. Wallpaper was one of these fashionable, desirable luxury goods, appearing in shop windows across Britain during this period, designed to seduce customers and to create new wants. An item intended for display in the homes of anyone who could afford to buy into this lifestyle. So the wallpaper trade enjoyed huge growth in output during the period that I've studied, as you can see from the graph here. So a steady incline, one or two dips, but in the main rising upwards. And the development of the market amongst the relatively larger social group of the middling classes was key to this growth. So what were the reasons for the expansion in the trade? Well, we can examine this through the context of urban and cultural histories. In the case of urban history, a major factor driving this growth was the unprecedented amount of house building that took place in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Fueled by population rise and industrial and commercial development, high levels of urbanisation took place, not only in London and existing towns like York and Newcastle, for example, but also in newly established regional centres such as Liverpool and Manchester. And it was to this new group of urban middle classes that the wallpaper trade had most appeal. During this period of building booms, wallpaper offered an expedient form of decoration for numerous speculative builders at this time, as it was cheaper than other decorative alternatives such as wood panelling, for example. On the other hand, rather than just decorating a house with plain painted plaster walls, a fashionable wallpaper hung in even just one room in a house could give a builder the edge over his competitors when he was selling his houses. For From a cultural point of view, possession of wallpaper, like other consumer goods, gave one status and a stamp of respectability. Key values in the culture of the middle classes and above. Rooms that were both social and private spaces within the home, such as the drawing room and parlour, were decorated to reflect status, but increasingly in a light, comfortable and hospitable way through the use of soft furnishings, curtains, upholstered furniture, carpets and wallpaper as a decorative backdrop instead of cold plaster walls. Possession of these items, as you can see in the slide, could indicate that you were familiar with what was fashionable and respectable, and you understood about taste and appropriate decor. Although possessions may have varied in quantity and value according to one's wealth, this culture of polite sociability and respectability, expressed through the decoration and equipping of domestic spaces, was understood and practiced across several levels of the middle and upper classes. We can see in this satirical print, here they're making fun of the ethos of this, hinting at hypocrisy as Captain Jessamy is learning the proper discipline of the couch. They're figures standing within a typically respectable interior, but he's lolling about and flirting with the lady in a less than respectable way. It was in these social spaces in the home that the new fashionable drinks of tea, coffee and hot chocolate would be offered. The ritual of visiting and taking tea was an important social indicator, as it allowed for the display of genteel manners, respectability, social status and ownership. This was conveyed through the new fashionable accessories of the tea table, including porcelain or china cups and silver or ceramic teapots. This image is a fragment of wallpaper from a townhouse in Diss from the 18th century. It's poorly executed and it represents a cheaper type of wallpaper produced at the time, but its depiction of the objects associated with tea drinking indicates that the owner understood the symbolic implications of this genteel social ritual. And what in effect it's saying is, I understand about wallpaper and I can afford it, and I also know about tea drinking. So the imagery within wallpapers also reflected other social and cultural movements of the period, and the choice of pattern was either subliminally or overtly suggestive of other qualities of the owner. For example, the design of wallpapers and many consumer goods were also based on a desire to display the current values of good taste, restraint and improvement. By the third quarter of the 18th century onwards, these qualities were expressed by neoclassical styles. This was a fashionable movement influenced by art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, as enjoyed by the elite on the Grand Tour, and then they brought these designs and styles back home. Buying these styles implied that you were a knowing, cultured and enlightened consumer, even if you hadn't actually been on the Grand Tour yourself. There's two wallpapers here that are based on a neoclassical style, within these types of wallpapers, simpler and cheaper versions of this neoclassical style were available by distilling down motifs taken from this repertoire. So Greco-Roman pillars and vertical ornaments seen in architecture were translated into stripes and vertical bows, and classical devices were alluded to via stylized details such as scrolls, as we can see there, laurel leaves, as we can see on the pink one on the right, and acanthus scrolls on the one on the top left, acanthus leaves. This period of the long 18th century also witnessed the Enlightenment, a new intellectual and philosophical movement which championed the ideals of improvement, rationality and scientific reason. Culturally, these ideas were manifest by the urban middle classes and gentry through participation in leisure activities such as attending scientific lectures, joining libraries and educational societies. Within the home, these ideals of progress and reason also permeated the choices for decoration, with simple patterned wallpapers representing geometric designs and reflecting shapes and organisms seen through the newly developed and improved scientific instruments such as the microscope. So you can see here geometric arrangement of patterning put together randomly with some neoclassical scrolling on the top left there, covering all bases there, and the bottom right, amoeba type blobby shapes. In both of these examples, the consumer could express a familiarity with the qualities of erudition and improvement through their home decor. There are parallels here with other luxury goods and semi-luxury goods, textiles, ceramics, metalware, etc., produced at the time. They all shared the similar imagery and patterns according to what was the fashion for that particular year, or that look for that particular year. But there are certain characteristics that are particular to wallpapers that set them apart from other luxury and semi-luxury goods for the home in this period. And these differences and potential obstacles to purchase indicate just how desirable wallpaper was. So, firstly, wallpaper was purely decorative. So unlike a cup or a piece of furniture, you couldn't actually use it. It didn't contribute to any function within the room other than pure decoration. Secondly, it was a one-off purchase. Once it was on the walls, it wasn't easily removed and hung elsewhere. Couldn't take it anywhere else, unlike a treasured possession like a piece of furniture or a clock or some silverware, for example. And it was also therefore not bequeathable, and you couldn't sell it if you needed to. So it was lacking in any handing on value. Once it was bought, it incurred further costs to actually hang it, so you had to pay labour costs to have it hung properly, and also you had to pay material costs for lining paper and paste, etc. Crucially, wallpaper was taxed during this period up until 1836, averaging out at about 1 3/4 pence per yard in excise on top of the cost of the wallpaper. This was essentially VAT on top of the wallpapers, which was payable upfront by the manufacturers, but costs were then in turn passed on to the consumer. So this meant that wallpapers could not be sold below a certain price without incurring losses, without the manufacturers incurring losses themselves. So this then raised the question, given these extra expenses and therefore seemingly restricted market, how was this consumer demand for wallpapers reconciled with its manufacture and supply? To answer this, I decided to look at how the trade was structured and organised at the time. Previous histories of the wallpaper trade had centred around a few famous names, whom it was suggested were master craftsmen and highly skilled artisans working in small workshops producing a high-end luxury product for the upper classes. Here we see trade card of Richard Mansfield in the Strand. You see this card quite a lot because it's such a lovely trade card, but also consulting these trade cards in previous research had led us to believe that Richard Mansfield was the one and only person who was ever going to be making wallpapers. He made them all himself, and then he came out in his fashionable attire and served these fashionable ladies in his very, very fashionable shop. However, so in order to prove whether this was the case or not, sources were really, really limited here in studying for my PhD. There's no substantial business archive for the wallpaper trade, and no first-hand accounts really available for me to interrogate for primary material. But by looking at the backgrounds of those involved, it was possible to work out how the workshops were run and to discover that they were in fact run on a large scale by successful, affluent businessmen and investors with partnership links and networks across related trades, such as that of wholesale paper and paint manufacture. So not small-scale artisans, but rich businessmen with business acumen. Instead, many of the businesses were operated on this sort of a scale during the period that I was studying. Production, mainly based in London, was concerned with appealing to as wide a customer base as possible by supplying a range of wallpapers at different prices, starting from around 2.5 pence up to several shillings per yard. There was a prestige range of expensive wallpapers and a sort of essentials range, if you will, with all of the possibilities in between. But the bulk of the production was concentrated on the manufacture of their mainstream, more affordable wallpapers for the much larger consumer group of the middling classes. The work itself was carried out by a handful of skilled and experienced London journeymen, under the supervision of a foreman working on behalf of the business owners. Papers were hand block printed in paint using patterns carved into wooden blocks, so like an elaborate potato cut, if you will. Each colour requiring a different block to be cut. The journeyman worked on the more expensive, colourful patterns, but the cheaper and more simple prints were produced by semi- and unskilled labourers and children who were paid at a much lower rate. Once the more difficult elements of interpreting and carving the wallpaper pattern into the printing blocks had been done, the more simple printing of the wallpaper and other tasks could be carried out by less skilled workers. Wallpaper production lent itself easily to this type of division of labour and made it possible to increase efficiency and save on labour costs. In an effort to expand the market as far as possible, notwithstanding the bottom line price imposed by the wallpaper tax, ways were sought to make labour and equipment as cost-effective as possible. The cheaper process of stenciling was used in combination with block printing to reduce the cost of carving the blocks. So on this wallpaper, the blue elements have been stenciled on. They're a bit blobby and misregistered. I don't know if you can see, particularly on the left-hand side. And the white trellis pattern, which is a little bit more detailed, has been block printed over. So one stencil and two stencils, blue and black, and then one white carved block. So only one block required on that particular paper. Similarly, patterns made from metal inserts and pins hammered into the printing block, as opposed to actually carving the detail, saved craftsman carver costs and also resulted in the blocks lasting longer for the business owners. So the little yellow stems there are made by brass pins that have been hammered in, which a less skilled person could obviously do without actually having to do the carving. Ingenious adaptation of the stock of block prints allowed manufacturers to produce up-to-date, fashionable wallpapers which required only a few blocks to print. So in this one, a fashionable lace pattern in French grey was produced from only one block, printed first in black and then again in white, slightly offset to the right to create a three-dimensional effect. Similarly, in this example, the same block has been used twice. It's just been printed once in white and then it's just been turned on its side and printed in a different colour to create this rustic textured weave effect, which is particularly fashionable towards the end of the 18th century and early 19th. All of these wallpapers were available at a range of prices depending on the degree of embellishment, the number of carved blocks, and the quality of the paints and paper used, thus maximising the cost-effectiveness of the manufacturer's stock of blocks. Popular selling lines were tweaked and modified slightly each year to offer a must-have pattern for the new season, but with minimal outlay. Business success in conquering the middle-class market lay therefore in the production of a quick turnover of high-volume sales with low profit margins distributed through a network of contacts across Britain. The leading London manufacturers established their reputations via their high-end ranges of wallpapers supplied to the gentry and upper classes, and each had a prestigious shop or wholesale offices in the fashionable shopping streets of the West End or the City of London, which we would now recognise as a sort of flagship store. Whoops. Sorry, back. Well, thank you, Rowie. And it doesn't appear to go backwards. Oh, thank you. Yes, the menu. There we are. This is an example of one of their shops. This is actually the Strand, where Richard Mansfield had his shop, just at the very, very end, disappearing off the end of the picture, and a few decades after Mansfield had died, but his business was handed. He sold his business on to somebody else, so it was still a wallpaper shop at this point. But obviously they had these high-profile shops in London, on which they were building their reputation to sell their wallpapers around the country. So riding on this reputation, they were able to secure recognition and sales for their more extensive, cheaper ranges of wallpaper across a vast network of retail and wholesale contacts and commissioning agents in towns all over the country and abroad. By the 1830s, well over 50% of the market share in the wallpaper trade was in the hands of less than 10 manufacturers. Lacking the advantages of economies of scale and large capital investment, it became increasingly more difficult for the small tradesmen and new startups to compete with these major wholesalers who had consolidated their position, wealth and reputation since the middle of the 18th century. These now formed an oligarchy of wallpaper manufacturers who could easily knock out any competition. Discounts for bulk sales were offered via their extensive network of retail contacts to consumers hungry to possess London-manufactured wallpapers. Loss leaders were offered for sale to eager customers by those market leaders who were sufficiently rich to withstand a temporary hit or two. And thus it was through the trade's business strategies, which were designed to increase their profits, that the consumer could benefit from opportunities to buy more affordable wallpapers. So just to conclude, the research that I've undertaken challenges the previous perceptions of wallpaper as a luxury goods item predominantly bought by the upper classes. By exploring the trade through the multidisciplinary approach of economic, social and business histories, as well as through the context of material culture by looking at the wallpapers themselves, it's possible to understand how supply and demand for wallpapers intersected each other during the long 18th century. It's also possible to gain a deeper understanding of how a much broader range of wallpaper styles were made available for the much larger social group of the middle classes, and therefore what this can then tell us about their values, choices, aspirations and tastes. Thank you.
Will you also...
Is it a copy of my thesis?
Is it big enough?
Is it chocolates? Thank you, thank you. Oh, sorry.
And this is
thank you.
Where should we go
Thanks ever so
to?
much. That's lovely, thank you.
Congratulations.
Perfect.
Thank you.